Hi, and welcome back to Guff Stuff Weekly Podcast. I'm Javan, who I will be referred to sometimes in this episode as Winklebot. Um, I'll explain that in a second. With me today, I have the one, the only PcSpaceGoon.
I don't know if I'm the only one. There's probably somebody out there with this handle, but thank you. Thank you for bringing me on the podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for joining me. And today, we are going to be talking about Total War games. Um,
Heck yeah.
what is a loosely defined Total War game, Mr. Goonman?
Well, Total War is a series by Creative Assembly that is essentially a combination of turn-based overarching strategy, which then breaks down into real-time strategy on the battlefield. Which is not something we see very often. There are a couple games out there that do it, but for the most part, people shy away from it. It's kind of a complicated game type to make hit properly.
So one could say like the overworld is kind of like a turn-based game, sort of like Civilization, to name like one of the other big ones in the genre. And then
Yeah.
the battles that you fight within the game are more of like a real-time strategy, almost like a StarCraft or something similar in that vein.
Yeah. Only in the battles are just like strictly your units hit each other. There's no like building construction or that kind of thing like in other real time strategy games.
All right, so whatever you go
Uh,
into the battle with is what you have essentially.
yeah. You build all your stuff in the turn based over map, and then once you go into a fight, that's what you got. You got to just make do.
Okay. What was your entry to the Total War series? What was your first game?
The original Shogun, way back in the day, which was subsequently the first Total War game that was ever created. Back when all the units were 2D sprites running around on the battlefield, and when units engaged, you couldn't tell what was going on at all. You just kind of hoping your guys were winning. You should mouse over and be like, "How we doing, boys?" Uh, it was pretty good. It was very simple. And back in those days too, the overmap, like in Civilization, you have like hexes and stuff, right?
Yep.
Um, More modern Total War games, the turn-based part doesn't have like lines on the map. Essentially, there's territories and stuff, but you have like a movement amount for each one of your armies. Whereas way back during like Shogun and Medieval, like the first ones, you moved your pieces like from spot to spot. Essentially, there were only so many territories on the map, and you would just move entire armies like from a territory to another, and there's no like in between.
Okay. So let's boil down to some of the main mechanics of these games then. Um, what what is like what do you control, and then what are you using for resources and things like that? What's the like general game plan of the game, the underlying mechanics, so to speak, in simple terms?
So most, yeah. So pretty much all Total Wars, you have like a economic resource that is like your primary, and then there's like trade and stuff as well. But that basically is just to get you more of the main economic resource, which usually people just refer to as gold. Sometimes it's other things, but
Okay.
um, and that's what you use to purchase your buildings, which again is on the overmap, and your units, and um, that's how you what you use to put together your armies. You have a max unit cap of in an army of usually 20, um, and then like each one of those individual units is going to have like a certain amount of men to it as well. So you can get some pretty big battles going. Uh, but yeah, pretty the economy side of it, like the straight up just regular economy side of it, is not like horribly complicated because the focus is more on the fighting side of things in Total War as opposed to like Civilization, where there's a whole lot of other things going on.
Right.
Um, a lot of historic Total Wars though still have like a bunch of um, like civic mechanics and things like that, like trying to make sure your people don't starve or uh, try not to get overthrown as being in charge, trying to keep people happy so they don't defect from your faction, things like that.
Okay.
But the money part of it is pretty straightforward for the most part.
Yeah, my entry to the series was Total War Rome 2, and there were some pretty
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
mechanics in that where like culture had a big thing, like the Hellenistic culture. Um, uh, what were some of the other cultures in that? I can't even remember now. It's been so long. But basically,
Well, I mean,
go ahead.
yeah. I mean, you basically just had your like your religions, and then like your obviously your different cultural states or whatever, and you can change those over time using agents or buildings like churches and things. But um, clearly, if you are like Islamic and you charge into a Christian region and take that over, people there are instantly going to be like, okay, cool, great, I'm so happy, you know. So like, there's a lot of like grinding over time as far as like changing people's view of you as the conqueror, as it were.
Right.
So lots of things could happen rebellion wise, and your money could be completely messed up in those regions because people don't want to work for you, things like that.
Okay. And on the overmap, there are certain things you can control. I think there's only like, from my understanding, like four things. You have heroes slash lords, agents, boats, and cities. Is that pretty much it? These are the things that you can interact with on the overmap.
Um, Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that pretty much covers it, unless it might be something that I'm forgetting about. But yeah, on the older Total Wars, it was mostly just like your armies with your generals, and then you'd have your agents on the overmap, and then yeah, you'd have your each individual like capital city for the region, and then any ships that you had, which for the most part ships are uh just there to hit. Like they when they run into each other, you just shake dice at each other. There's only a couple Total War games that like really break down the ship combat in a more complicated fashion.
Okay. Um.
There's probably
Yes.
more that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Now I'm thinking of it. Yeah, but there's I guess I would say a lot of the ship combat is not particularly dense in Total War. It's either auto calculating, so basically just shaking dice, or really simple units as far as the ships are concerned. There are some that a couple of Total Wars that have much more complicated ship combat though.
Okay. Cool. So let's dive into a little bit of the nitty gritty then. Let's talk about the battles themselves. Now, every unit in the battle has a line of statistics, and that determines like attack and defense and all these different things. And then
Yep.
you also have sometimes like abilities that you can use in uh, like really real time battles. Is that pretty common amongst most of the Total War games, or is that just for like some of the newer ones?
The older games, you would normally have like passive things on your generals in combat, that would affect what was going on.
Okay.
Uh, Newer Total Wars have a lot more like activated abilities and things like that. Um, Usually, it's just kind of like overarching things that you got on your guys as you went through their campaigns, essentially. And in older Total Wars, your guys could die of old age, so like you can always have like a god running around
Right.
that's collected all the good stats, you know?
You can't just beef one guy up and take over the map with him.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Um, so let's talk about some of the titles that are available in historic Total Wars.
Oh gosh.
I know we have like the Rome quote unquote series, which is Rome 1, Rome 2, and then Attila. Would that be considered one of the parts of the Rome
I mean,
series?
I would probably lump it in there.
Okay.
Kind of like an expansion to Rome, I would say.
Okay. And then recently we have Three Kingdoms, which takes place in Dynasty era China, right?
Yeah, yeah. Pouring out for Three Kingdoms.
Okay. Um,
Sad days.
and then we have Shogun, which you talked about earlier. When does that take place, and how many games are in that one?
You've got the original Shogun, and then you have Shogun 2, and then you have Fall of the Samurai and Rise of the Samurai, which are both expansions to Shogun 2. I would say Fall of the Samurai is, I mean, it is an expansion, but like they add so much in that it's almost its own game, particularly because the time period is like really separated from the base game for Shogun 2. So
Okay.
um, yeah, so that's 3 games as well, I guess. Yeah.
And that's in like that's at the end of feudal era Japan, right? During the like samurai shogun
Yeah, yeah. It's like so
era.
Rise of the Samurai is basically obviously like during the Rise of the Samurai. Um, and then yeah, like the Shogun 2 uh is um during like the big warring periods there, the shogunate and everything.
Okay.
And then you get up into Fall of the Samurai, which is it, like almost like Victorian era, where it's you have like rifles, even as some of your higher tier troops.
Yeah, there was an American captain, historically speaking, somewhere around the time of like late 1890s or mid 1890s that basically broke his way into Japan to force them to trade with the rest of the world. Is it kind of around that time?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You have the foreign powers messing with Japan and like selling them all kinds of stuff, and you're like, yeah, yes, yes, buy our guns and then kill each other with them. Yes.
Okay. And then we talked about I don't know if we talked about Total War. There's medieval, right?
Medieval, yes.
Okay. And that's during the reign of
Yeah.
like
So there's Medieval
Charlemagne
One.
and all that, or when is that?
I don't remember exactly what the time period is for Medieval. It's different for Medieval One and Two.
Okay. But so yeah, so the medieval series, what's some of the features in those
Yeah.
ones?
So I mean, your Medieval Total War One and Two. Medieval Total War One is the one immediately following Shogun One, so you're still like very like simplistic as far as gameplay goes, which is fine. Like it is still a lot of fun, but you're still like 2D sprites on the battlefield, that sort of thing, and controls were a bit janky and all that. Um, Medieval Two, you get um, a lot more options going on because it's actually like 3 dimensional, and um, all the units are like fully displayed. And a lot of people really like Medieval Two because it's knights in Europe, right? So a lot of people can get behind that general idea. It's an aesthetic that many people could look at it and be like, ah, that's cool. I like that.
Right.
Giant guys in armor slamming into each other. I can dig that. And most people are like tangentially at least aware of that time period also, so it has made it one of the more popular games in the series.
Okay. Kind of gives it a little bit more weight with the player base.
Yeah, yeah,
I think some of the other ones. I know there's a Viking one, Thrones of Britannia, and that's a saga, right?
yeah. There's yeah, yeah. So there is for I don't even know if Creative Assembly is doing Saga games anymore. They may have like looked at that and been like, oh, we're gonna try this out, and then I haven't really because like the new game coming out, Pharaoh, they haven't said anything about it being a Saga game, even though that might normally fall in that category. So they potentially have decided that they don't like doing that. I'm not sure. I'm just um this is conjecture on my part,
Okay.
but yeah, Britannia would have fallen into that Saga category, which is supposed to be like a smaller scale version of a Total War game. Um, to like focus on like a really specific time period and potentially like with uh less overarching units and stuff like that. Because like this, like going with Britannia, it's like this is England, right? It was just England pretty much. So
And that had to do with the the heathen invasion of England, I believe, with like Ivar the Boneless and the Sons of Ragnar. Is that correct? Am I crazy in that? or was it even
I
further
believe that
along?
is correct. I um I would have to look it up honestly.
Okay.
I didn't spend a lot of time with Thrones. Thrones is probably uh probably the least favorite game of all the Total War games from the fan base anyway, from
Okay.
what I could gather from listening to people talk. I didn't mind it too much, but I also didn't spend a ton of time with it either.
All right.
So
And then
take it as you will, I suppose.
I think the other one that we're missing now, and this one's kind of pseudo historical, and that would be Troy.
Yeah, Troy, which was Creative Assembly, kind of like it's really hard for them to make historical games after Warhammer Total War came out.
Right.
It's been pretty difficult for them to kind of like harness a big audience. So they were kind of trying a few different things to be like, all right, well, this is going to be historical in the Bronze Age, kind of, but also we're going to have monsters, but they're not really monsters. They're just people, but maybe they're like people with cow's heads that they're wearing. They're minotaurs, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Things like that. Um, so it is an interesting take on it, which I don't think really worked out for them ultimately, unfortunately. Again, I thought Troy was pretty fun, and it was um, one of the few Total War games that they actually like started adding more resources as well. It's not just like you have gold. There you go. Boom. You actually had like other things to try to take control of and collect up to actually like build your units and buildings and stuff.
Okay. Cool. So they kind of took a page then from like you said, the Warhammer, where they have the extra resources to build certain items and buildings and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room then. Possibly their most successful series. I would say by far
Yeah.
and away their most successful series.
Yeah, yeah. I would definitely agree with that.
I know I was foaming at the mouth when it came out. I barely touched Rome 2. I'd played maybe one or two campaigns, and I'm like, this series really isn't for me. This Total War thing. And then Total War Warhammer got announced, and I lost my mind, along with about 90% of the GW fan base.
Yeah. Um like initially again, this is going to be conjecture on my part, but obviously Warhammer Fantasy Battles was a tabletop version.
Yep.
And Games Workshop was kind of like steering away from that and killing it, as it were, so they could go to Age of Sigmar.
Yep.
And the existence of Warhammer Total War, we wonder if the only reason that it was able to come out in the first place was the fact that they were canning the tabletop, and they're like, well, we're not doing anything with this IP anyways, we might as well sell it to Creative Assembly, or like get some royalties on Creative Assembly as they do some other random nonsense with it. Why not?
And then it just kind of exploded
uh,
from there.
yeah, yeah. Which I mean, I don't see how it really wouldn't, because like that setting, fantasy, is obviously a pretty broad setting that a lot of people can like go, oh, I kind of know what's going on here, even if they don't know specifically what's going on. And then you have the entire Warhammer Fantasy Battles fan base there's now losing their tabletop version essentially to begin with. So it like allows them to like continue playing that in a way. It's not exactly the same, obviously, but it's probably as close as you're gonna get in a like computer version.
Right.
So
So let's talk about it a little bit. Let's talk about the Warhammer series. Let's start with Warhammer 1. What what did they introduce, and basically how did it set them apart in your mind from the historical Total Wars, and really just kind of change their formula?
so big thing I feel like, so one of the major differences between the historic Total Wars and like Warhammer Total War is that the focus, like I said earlier, the focus has always been on combat in Total War, but the focus is like really on combat in Warhammer, particularly with Warhammer 1. Like the overmap stuff, they scaled back significantly, which this is both good and bad from a uh, a person that's played Total War games since the first one, like it's kind of bad for me because I want a bunch of systems to mess around with, right? But when you're bringing in a whole bunch of new people that have never played Total War before, because you're opening up to fantasy and Warhammer and all this stuff, having less systems to deal with in the overarching, like trying to balance your political and all this other stuff, it is a lot easier to enter into it and then get into the part where you're smashing orcs into humans and things like that. So I think it, in some ways, simplifying the overmap and really focusing on the combat probably helped to like make it more popular among people that may not have been like diehard Total War fans.
Yeah, and I think that was definitely true in my case. I know the coming in at Rome too, it was really overwhelming. There was a lot of things to worry about. And then I go in and I play Total War Warhammer, and basically it's dialed way back in complexity. But like one of the cool things for me was that they added magic, which was definitely a more complex system than that didn't exist at all in the previous Total Wars, from my understanding. And but it allowed for
Yeah, oh,
some
yeah,
really
for
cool
sure.
things to happen on the battlefield, and that's where we talked about earlier the extra buttons, so to speak, that you get to press in the battles to summon different things or cause different abilities or effects really adds to the collective experience of the fantasy setting.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously, like having things like flying units, which is something that
Yep.
older Total Wars did not have. So you had flying units, you had magic, and it just added a lot to the spectacle, which again brings in a lot more people to the genre in general, that may not have shown up otherwise.
Right. They added that extra element of wackiness, craziness, and chaos, so to speak, that could happen in a battle. I know that would definitely. I know that definitely brought me in. Just the even the visuals. The visuals were like amazing, um, as well. Um, you still had to buy the blood pack, which was unfortunate, but like well, that's a whole other topic in and of itself, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
But
um,
and then
yeah, being able to.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. We're gonna have a nice off,
Yeah, nice
Midwestern
off.
nice
Yeah.
off.
Um, I guess I
And now that both of us have forgotten what we were gonna say.
yeah. So let's just let's go forward a little bit to where they turned the amp up to 11, so to speak, and
Hell yeah,
really
let's do it.
really defined what the Warhammer game was about, and that to me was Total War Warhammer 2, and that game
Yes.
completely just blew away all expectations that I had of any strategy game at the time because of the depth and scope of it.
Yeah, well, at least it got there. On release, um, it was okay. It was alright, you know.
All right.
Uh, but it was so Warhammer One was pretty simple for the most part. And there were things like if you were humans, you like couldn't take over like dwarf territory and things like that. Like you were region locked. Um,
hmm
in in certain places. So like, or if you were vampires, you could only take over all of the Reichland, and you couldn't like go wander off at other places. Whereas obviously Warhammer Two, they took that away because a lot of people complained about that. Uh, it's kind of made for like I can understand what they were going for, but it made for some weird kind of interactions where you're trying to like I'm trying to take over the world and I can't actually capture settlements, so I'm just going to like slowly work my way across the board, burning things to the ground. Um, So they did away with that with Warhammer 2, which overall I feel like it set the stage for the rest of interaction with the way the series works. Um, but they had the elves, dark elves, the lizard men, the rats, and they had a couple factions for each of those essentially.
hmm
So really, Warhammer 2 coming out of the gate didn't have a ton of new stuff. It's kind of a little bit like a rearrangement of some of the stuff they were already doing, and then like a slightly larger scale. because they didn't even have the combined maps on release. That it took several months for them to combine Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 maps together into Mortal Empires. So like you just played the Vortex map, which is cool and all. I'm sure a lot of people will immediately gasp in horror at me saying anything about the Vortex map being cool, but like the first few times you played it, at least it was I thought it was fun. Yeah, I could definitely see it getting like if you played it, if that's all there was to play, you get pretty tired of it though. So
Right.
I get that, but uh, yeah, but then they expanded on that like greatly throughout the course of Warhammer 2's life. It became like the an ultimate version of like fantasy battling essentially.
Right. And then the other thing to note too is that this is true going forward in each of the series of the Warhammer games, is that you could play all of the factions and essentially use the map um, in addition to the factions that you have in the next game. So all of your factions in Warhammer 1 and the map that was used in Warhammer 1 was effectively added to the Mortal Empires campaign, which is a specific campaign in Warhammer 2. And the same can be said moving forward to Warhammer 3, which opened up a lot of possibilities of things for people.
Yeah, yeah, it gave people I don't know what they're chopping at the bit for, or champing, I guess. It's not chomping, it's champing. Of course, it's champ. Anyways,
You heard
um,
it here.
uh, right. So like being able to take all of their cool toys and slam them into each other across continents, essentially, right?
Yeah.
It's what people were looking for, and it's what we got with Warhammer 2. And so yeah, it really turned out to be like super cool.
Okay. The other thing I do want to touch on, Warhammer 2 added one of my favorite things to the series, which was breath weapons. All of a sudden now your dragons can breathe fire, which
Yes, and then spin
completely
in
just
circles.
completely just helped me with my immersion into what was going on.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
trying to think if Warhammer 1 had any dragons in it. Was there? Because there were you had like the griffins or whatever, but I think there was like the chaos dragons or whatever for like the sorcerers. Remember correctly, but it's been such a long time. Yeah, obviously like the elves. Bringing things like the elves, you end up with like big monsters like dragons and stuff. Their ability to breathe fire and cause all kinds of chaos, and then
yeah, and then
all the troubles that come with trying to get your dragon to actually breathe fire on the correct target and things like
they
that.
added a ton of different magic types as well, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah. We went from all the like the base magic types essentially in the Warhammer universe to like adding on we added on a bunch more uh which for the most part the everything past like the base magic types you're going to get like more like utility magic for the most part. Um so those could be really good or really bad depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So it really depends. Like the primary magic types that you had in like Warhammer 1 are still probably going to be seen as usually like the best ones. But yeah, the newer ones are still cool and had plenty of like, utility you could throw into fights.
Quick sidebar before we jump into 3. Do you have a favorite spell, so to speak, from the Warhammer series?
Um, I mean, if I want to be real basic, piercing bolts of burning is really freaking fun.
Okay.
It's- and it kills things and it does it in a wide area and it looks pretty cool. Raining fire on people.
Yeah.
Uh, but again, it's I guess that's kind of playing hours and hours and hours. It's effective and looks good while doing it. So I guess that's probably mine right off the top of my head, anyways.
Yeah.
How about you?
The one that blew me away, and it still to this day blows me away every time I cast it, is Comet of Cassandora. Uh, Basically, just a
Yes.
giant meteor falls from the sky and onto the battlefield. That and the foot of Gork, the giant green foot that comes down and just they're just visually stunning, and the physics effects and stuff that happen because of them are just absolutely awesome.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, well, they have modified Comet over time. Comet was very pretty, very effective, but also um, normally wasn't one that people went to because of casting cost. It was
Right.
very expensive for what it did by comparison to other spells. Um, you want to be all like push up glasses nerd about it. But yeah, if you just want like visually stunning, yeah, I think Comet's probably like one of the best looking spells in the game
Yeah,
for
it's
sure.
it's really cool. So yeah, that's a little bit about magic. Let's go into it's a hot button topic lately, but we'll maybe touch on that a little bit later. Let's talk about Warhammer 3, and this is supposedly the climax, the pinnacle, the ultimatum of the series. This is the last one in the Warhammer series, from what we know so far.
Yeah, right. Unless they suddenly decide that they were going to make a four, but yeah, when they first came out with Warhammer 1, they're like, we're going to make 3 games. So obviously, Warhammer 3 is the natural progression. Boom, they've done it. They've made their 3 games. Um, how long they're going to keep making Warhammer 3, obviously, is going to depend on a lot of factors. But so far, they seem to be chugging along with it and adding more and more stuff. So that's cool. Uh, yeah, again, Warhammer 3 had kind of the same problem that Warhammer 2 had on release. I think a lot of people weren't around for the release of Warhammer 2 or don't remember like how kind of like eh, most people were
Right.
when Warhammer 2 came out. Like it's the second game. It should be like oh crazy, and then it had cool stuff, but it wasn't still um wasn't like really different,
Yeah, nothing to
And
really
Warhammer
blow
3
you
kind of
away.
suffered. Yeah, Warhammer 3 definitely suffered from some of the same problems where it's kind of like, eh. And even some of the same like glitchy stuff where like some of the stats were even like moved back a bit from like the end of Warhammer 1 into Warhammer 2, and the same thing from Warhammer 2 into Warhammer 3. Like some of the stats seem to have gotten like reverted, which was obviously weird and very frustrating for some people,
Right.
myself included. Um, so and there's some reasons for that. I mean, I'm not gonna say they're good reasons, but there's reasons. Uh so again, like you don't get the full big map immediately upon release of Warhammer 3. You just have the what is something of chaos? What the heck is it even called? The campaign, Realm of Chaos or something like that.
Yeah,
I think.
Realm of Chaos, I believe it was
Uh,
called.
yeah, yeah. Which again is a cool campaign. The first few times.
Right.
So was if you're like stuck playing that for months and months, your brain kind of like goes numb. Um, Everybody really, really wanted to see the big map, and it took a while before they were able to get that out the door. And then people were able to really get their hands on what they felt like the real game was. So release again, like seemingly for most Total War games, release kind of spooky, and then eventually we're building into something that more people have been happier with, minus the very most current stuff that's happened, obviously.
Yeah. So, as far as Total War Warhammer 3 goes, after a certain point, it was just the natural progression from 2, and basically it just added new factions, added some new magic types. Did it add any new mechanics? I can't remember. Oh wait, no, it
I mean,
did
there's like
add
quality of life stuff, but
with the Warriors of Chaos update. They did add I think it's a new mechanic with the ability to upgrade your units.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's an old new mechanic, so it's new for Warhammer Total War, but that's like an old Total War mechanic, which a lot of people throughout the course of Warhammer Total War were like, why can't we upgrade our units? Because this is something you could do in historic Total Wars,
Hmm.
basically from forever. Was add upgrades to your units, either through like blacksmiths or just be able to be like, okay, I can now get this higher tier unit. I'm just going to turn this guy into this guy.
Yeah, my Hestardi are
So
now
yeah,
becoming my Triari and stuff like that.
yeah. Obviously, it would be along the same line style of unit, right? But
Hmm.
yeah, you could actually like get more elite units. Yeah, the Warriors Chaos obviously brought that in, which was very cool because it's something people have been asking for a while.
Well, and that faction
Um,
felt like super juiced and out of control when that first released because it was like when I started playing the Warriors of Chaos in Total War Warhammer 3 when they did that release, I'd go back and I'd try to play like Skaven, which were like one of my all-time favorites, and it was not as fun because I had no progression for my units. It felt half-baked, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like they could definitely do that with more factions, as well, but they'd have to, oh, excuse me, put in all the like effort to, figure out what unit goes to what unit and all this other stuff.
Yeah,
Um, which is a lot of time on their part, which again is doable. It's just time and effort that they put in.
yeah, the
Um,
cost versus the reward thing.
yeah, yeah. Though it did obviously take the Wars of Chaos for being kind of like a blah faction for the majority of Warhammer 2, to being like a really cool and interesting faction in Warhammer 3. Because yeah, that faction had been suffering for quite a while as kind of like not updated. So like all the power creep and all of the other factions like gaining stuff and cool things to do, and meanwhile there's chaos over here with their like I've got a guy with a big hammer. He looks angry. Name's Kolak Sunnier,
Yeah,
like that was about it, So yeah, it would the attention that they put into the Warriors of Chaos update was very good, honestly. Put a lot of effort into it to actually make that faction competitive, I guess. Is what I
yeah.
would say.
I guess a couple other things I want to touch on before we wrap up would be the voice acting, which I thought was actually pretty well done. The different sound clips they have in the game and the sound design of the game itself. You really like hear the effects of things going on. You hear a guy going, "Oh my God, Boar's got his head chopped off," and stuff like that. And like if you zoom in, you can see all the effects and just the atmosphere that the game provides and supports is just really, really well done in my opinion. I'm sure there's small
Oh,
gripes and you hear the same sound clip over and over again and it gets old, but that first initial viewing of it is
I,
pretty impressive.
no, the voice acting is like on point throughout the entire Total War series. Like the voice acting is probably the thing that you could point at that you really can't complain about at any given juncture. I mean, you could always complain about everything, right? But
Hmm.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody go, man, I don't know about this voice acting thing. Like they always every single voice actor that has worked on this game has like brought their A game to it and they're really into it. So I definitely dig it. Like the only complaint I have ever had about it is nothing to do with the voice acting itself. It's like the like when you have a unit who's when you like right click to move them, they only have like two things that they say. So when you're like right clicking a lot to make them move, they're just going cycling back and forth between two things.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's a very very like shallow complaint, obviously. So
yeah. And then I guess the kind of final thing I want to touch on. I don't think we'll talk about the controversies that are going on with it. That's something the readers and listeners can go and find themselves if they are interested. I'd like to keep it fairly positive for the most part. And that would be the multiplayer, which I have
yeah,
a decent viewership experience with. Like I've watched several multiplayer tournaments and several streamers and things like that, but I don't have a whole lot of experience with myself. But from my understanding, the meta is pretty um, fairly diverse and it's fairly competitive across the board. Um, do you have any experience with the
yeah. So
multiplayer?
that would in Warhammer, not a great deal. I have played it to some extent, and I have played with some people that are really good, and they like showed me some things, uh, and kicked my butt around the field for a while as they proved how tactically superior they are to me in a multiplayer setting. Uh, but yeah, there's a lot that goes into it because of like unit selection and faction selection versus other factions. And then when you actually get on the battlefield, and Warhammer 3 has different modes as well, where it's not just like delete the opponent's army, you win when they're all dead. So things like the domination mode have added more like strategic elements to the multiplayer also.
Yeah, because having
But
like
I
a
mean,
tar pit to hold down a point, a unit that can just soak damage, is sometimes more important than a unit
yeah,
that can just delete other units.
right, exactly. probably the Total War game that I actually assuredly the Total War game that I have the most experience with in multiplayer is Shogun 2. Uh, and that game I had a great time with. There's a whole bunch of things they were doing with that game. There was what was referred to as the Avatar system, where you had like an overarching leader for your like multiplayer troops essentially. So you could like build out your armies and then like pick abilities and stuff like that. You go into your game and you basically would have like cards. So
Okay.
you're like, I'm going to battle and I have like these cards supporting my army, and then your opponent would have their cards, and then you could potentially have like cards that like negated other cards and things like that. So there's like an actual like meta going on layering over the top of the combat on the battlefield, which I thought was cool. And it's the only game that they've ever done it in, and I really wish they bring it back because man, it made multiplayer like more engaging for me, anyways, to be able to like think about these like different layers to it.
Right. It sounds like it adds quite a bit of diversity to it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
then the other facet of multiplayer that we should briefly touch on is co-op. From my understanding,
Oh
most
yeah,
of the Total War
total
games
total
have a
co-op.
co-op mode, right?
Yeah, going back to let's see, what was the first one that actually had a co-op? Empire does not have a co-op, so Napoleon does not have a co-op. Whatever came after Napoleon, I
I know
think
Rome
might have been
2
Rome.
did, and that
Was it
was
Rome
my
2?
first one, and that had a co-op
Yeah,
mode.
yeah, I think it was Rome 2 was the first one that had a co-op mode in it. Um, with its glorious desync. Anybody that's played Total War games in co-op, because probably has freaking desync horror stories where you'd have to freaking like share your save back with your co-op partner so you could get your games lined back up again. Uh, to prevent crashing and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, Warhammer, they've done a pretty good job with the co-op as far as like removing the desyncing issue, which has plagued Total War for a long time. And then it's just fun to play with your friend. You can just be like, all right, I want to take two factions that may not agree with each other, and let's see how they play together. Or let's take Bretonia and the Empire and just freaking go around freaking punching everybody in the face and balls.
Yeah.
You
Take
know.
Franz and
So
Louis and just sack the world.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. So it offers a different layer. I would say probably the biggest issue with co-op is that it takes away like pretty much all of the actual like campaign objectives. So you kind of going into it, if you want to have like a more like layered campaign, I would say you want to talk to your co-op partner and be like, hey, what kind of objectives do we want to go for in this campaign? So you can kind of like make your own objectives, or if you just want to go around beating people in the head, that's fine too. But if you want to have like a more complex campaign, you kind of have to like make that on your own. The game just kind of like
yeah,
after a
because
bunch of
the
settlements, I guess,
default
as
is
your
like
victory
what, paint the
conditions. So
map essentially.
yeah, pretty much, it's like three-quarters of the map you have to own or whatever, essentially.
Okay. Um, so yeah, I guess for people who to wrap everything up, for people who are interested in Total War, the historical side, where would you recommend that they start?
Uh, Rome 2 is actually a pretty good spot right now, honestly. Like as far as like the amount of stuff that's in it and the like how modern the control scheme is. Because that's a problem. Like the further you go back into Total War games, like the control scheme gets more and more archaic.
Right.
And if you're newer, you may not want to put up with that sort of thing. Like I think like some of the older titles with the worst control schemes might be better games, but Rome 2 is in a pretty good spot where it's at now and has more of this more modern stuff to work with, so you're not like completely out in the dark as far as like trying to control your units.
Right. And then as far as Warhammer, the Warhammer series goes, where would you recommend people start with that?
At this point, you might as well just jump into Warhammer 3. Like, there's no reason not to. Like, Immortal Empires, which is like all the maps put together now. Like, you don't need all three games anymore to actually do that. So you can just bail right into there and freaking start kicking at it.
Okay. And then I would recommend for people who start with Warhammer 3, I would add an addendum to what you just said of if you want to pick up extra factions or things like that, um, just basically wait for a sale, wait for Skulls Week or something like that, and usually you can pick things up
Yeah,
fairly
yeah.
cheap because it's a pretty high barrier to entry as far as price point.
Well, yeah, if you go out there and like just in like I'm going to buy all of the content, it is hundreds and hundreds of dollars at this point.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's cash wise big barrier to entry there if you want all of the game. But thankfully, you can buy it in little bits, and sales are usually pretty solid, upwards of like 75% off on DLCs, depending on how recent they are, essentially. So yeah, you can definitely get it on some of those Steam sales, and you'd be able to get some pretty solid DLC at good prices.
Awesome. Well, I think that covers Total War in a nutshell. And do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I mean, I have probably thoughts for days and days on Total War
Yeah.
games, so
And yeah, and if
we're
people are interested,
wrapping here. I should probably should.
if people are interested, we can definitely revisit this and take a deeper dive into them if need be. Or uh, do you know of any place on the internet people can go to learn more about these, Mr. PcSpaceGoon?
Oh boy, howdy do I. So I stream over on twitch.tv/PcSpaceGoon, and I also have a bunch of videos over on the YouTube channel, which is Pariah Caste Gaming over there on YouTube. Most of my YouTube stuff is like breaking down mechanics and things like that. Uh, and my over on Twitch. Recently, I've been streaming a lot of other stuff, but yeah, I've Warhammer and Total War in general has been my mainstay for like 6+ years over there. So
Okay.
yeah, I'm sure I'll come back around again.
Eventually, yeah. Okay. Well, cool. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully we'll have you again on another episode soon.
Heck yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. And we'll see you guys later this week on Guff Stuff Weekly.